It was time for the Romanian meat missile to make his college decision. He had a lot of teams courting him after a record-breaking senior year. After carefully looking at a number of schools, Arlo Karimova committed to FAU. Some top schools wanted him to walk on with promises that he could get a scholarship later on, but Arlo needed whatever financial support he could get since his family struggled to pay the bills since moving to Florida for his basketball career that prematurely ended. So he was looking for a school that would give him a full ride, and he wanted a school that was near where his parents had already been living. AK-47 committed to Florida Atlantic University and would begin his freshman year alongside several other outstanding freshman defensive linemen given the prestige of FAU. It's also important to note that Karimova had scholarships coming from UF, Florida State, and UCF, but he wanted a small college experience and he wasn't interested in all of the fanfare that other programs offered. The question would be how well this foreign kid from Romania could translate literally and metaphorically to college football. He managed to put on a significant amount of weight before his freshman year, adding nearly 40 pounds now that he would be taking this seriously. He only lost a little bit of quickness while putting on the weight, and he had finally gotten up to 250 pounds, which was still low for a 6'10" defensive end, but at least it was something. The first game of the season was against Miami, the only Florida college not to offer Karimova a spot. AK-47 desperately wanted to prove them wrong with a sack to start his college career. He continued to dominate off the edge with his bull rush moves and his signature meat missile launch that had opposing fan bases calling him a dirty player. Some people were comparing him to Zaza Pachulia, taking out quarterbacks' ankles as he would slide his helmet at 40 miles per hour across the turf. QBs were getting launched into the air like rag dolls from the power Karimova generated from his enormous length. Pause. Some fans were puzzled as to why Karimova chose FAU, but they didn't know his backstory. Arlo's family could never afford nice things, even when he was a top-tier national prospect for basketball. The NIL money was one thing for AK-47, but the full-ride scholarship and the proximity to his parents is what mattered most to him. Like Nikola Jokic for the Nuggets, football wasn't everything to Karimova, and it wasn't even in the top 5, but the money he could make from it and the education he received from it was priceless in his eyes. He wanted to make sure that he had enough money to send back to his extended family in Romania, and he wanted to provide for them so that they could live in luxury, and so that when he went back in the offseason every year, he could go on vacations with his family over there. So of course the next step for Karimova was making it to the NFL. Nowadays, freshmen are already planning out their futures in the NFL, and Karimova was no different. He noticed that despite being a true freshman starting at defensive end, he received very little attention compared to when he was playing in high school. Karimova realized that high school sports are all about hype and college is more about substance. People didn't expect much out of him or FAU in his freshman year. That really annoyed him as he tried to bring his social media presence up during his freshman season. He felt like he had missed the boat because all of the viral clips of him were made by other people while he only had 200 followers on TikTok himself. Karimova felt like he was the Zion Williamson of high school football highlights, but he needed to figure out how to build his draft resume. He wanted to enter the draft after his freshman year, but when he mentioned this to his teammate Evan Anderson, who played defensive tackle, Anderson laughed a little bit and then told AK-47 that he'd have to wait until after his junior year, most likely, to enter the draft. AK-47 rolled his eyes and said that Anderson was stuck with him then. Again, the FAU defensive line was incredibly young in AK-47's freshman year. Besides himself, the interior defensive line and the other edge were all freshmen too. Despite that fact, they were ranked as a top 25 defensive line by metrics in the nation, which was absolutely unheard of. What happened next was even more shocking. Arlo wanted to prove his decision to go to FAU right by beating every Florida team that they came up against. He pre-prepared his teammates each week on a Florida College Week. South Florida was no different. USF came into the game undefeated as well, and AK-47 displayed his dominance in not just rushing the passer, but in stopping the run this game too. FAU ended up blanking USF, holding them to 0 points, and despite how great the D was, there was growing concern with their offensive production. Local media outlets said that they wouldn't put FAU in the top 25 yet just because their offense had major question marks. One thing important to note about AK-47 was that he was a businessman. He was always coming up with entrepreneurial endeavors. Well, the Romanian meat missile, armed with $100,000 in a dream, opened up his first gentleman's club. Yep, that kind of gentleman's club. He brought in his defensive line teammates to hang out at the club, and he pitched each of them on being a co-owner in the club with promises of free TNA dances. His teammates respectfully declined, but that put Arlo in a little bit of a hole, and he didn't have enough funds to pay upfront for the whole lease of the club and for other miscellaneous expenses. So Arlo got into some shady dealings with some local loan sharks and secured himself enough funding for the club, but he was no longer the majority owner. The crowd AK-47 fell in with had access to illicit substances, and Arlo may or may not have snorted some of these substances substances on game days. He felt like it gave his meat missile launch an extra edge. FAU lost their first game of the season 9-7, and the offensive question marks were answered. FAU was unlikely to see the top 25 again this season after a terrible loss to MT. Karimova's substance use became a problem though once he started using it excessively. He was doing a little bit every day for the kick like it was coffee. He also became more aggressive, and he even injured one of his teammates during practice playing too recklessly. Karimova's brothers on the D-line noticed that his eyes were consistently bloodshot and that he was always hyperactive, and they came to the club one day to confront Arlo. When they arrived, they were shocked at how rundown the club was. What was once a clean, upscale gentleman's club now reeked of vomit, and it looked like it hadn't been cleaned in weeks. They searched for AK-47 and eventually found him in the VIP, where they staged an impromptu intervention to help him get it together. They talked about how the fame was getting to his head and that the money that he was going to use for the business venture was going up his nose instead of going to his relatives in Romania. AK-47 knew he had f***ed up. He also knew that his parents were going to come to the next home game against Marshall and that he needed to sober up before then. Before he got the chance to think about that too much though, the next game came against University of Alabama at Birmingham. UAB also had just one loss on the season. Perhaps the craziest play of the season happened in the third when Karimova was short on his signature meat missile launch into the quarterback's shins, and UAB's quarterback got the pass off to his wide receiver Dexter Boykin, who hauled it in over 3 defenders. FAU had one chance to win the game with no time left, and their quarterback airmailed the ball 15 yards out of bounds instead of giving his receivers a chance to catch it. It was another frustrating loss in which the offense put up just 7 points again, while the defense held the opposing team to 14 or less. Things were looking promising against Marshall when FAU answered with a touchdown in the first quarter, but the offense stalled all the way into the middle of the third quarter while Marshall had 17 on the board. AK-47's parents were at the game, and they noticed a surprisingly unimpactful performance from the 6'10" edge. Arlo was getting pressure and even stopping some runs, but he didn't have the same energy he had earlier in the season. What his parents didn't know was that AK-47 was going through withdrawals mid-game. He felt like garbage on the field, and it was like the Michael Jordan flu game, but instead of the flu, it was cocaine. Everything would change in the game though when Henry Colombi, the Marshall quarterback, forced a ball into the end zone on 4th down that FAU's safety intercepted and brought out of the end zone. Every one of the Marshall players were more concerned with a blindside block coming from Karimova rather than trying to tackle their safety, who ended up returning it 100 yards for the pick six. Like it was mentioned before, if the offense isn't going to get the defense more than 7 points to work with, the defense might just have to put points on the board themselves. FAU's defense came up clutch yet again in the 4th quarter, getting pressure and forcing Marshall's quarterback to throw a bad ball that got picked off again and returned for another touchdown. FAU would steal the game as Marshall couldn't get a playoff in time at midfield. The good news after the game was that AK-47's parents were so excited about the game and the overall defensive performance that they didn't question Karimova too much about how sluggish he was. But the bad news was that AK-47 wasn't quite in the clear. Arlo was randomly screened for a drug test, and he was freaking out all week about the results. He knew he had to play in the next game against Auburn, who was ranked 8th in the nation at the time. Arlo was sure that he was going to get suspended and miss the Auburn game, but on Friday before the game, he was on the phone with his parents when AK-47's teammate popped in to tell him the good news that he passed the screening because it was only for PEDs. Arlo was ecstatic that he'd be able to play against Auburn, but Karimova's parents were concerned by what they had heard. If Karimova was worried about passing a drug test but it wasn't for a PED, what could it be for? Auburn and FAU were tied to start the 4th, but Karimova was brought off the field for a dime package when Auburn scored and FAU couldn't tie it up, giving them their 3rd loss on the season. The next game came against Tulane, but Karimova had a really difficult time focusing on getting ready for the game or even playing in it because his parents had been grilling him so much about what he'd been up to. They didn't know that he co-owned a gentleman's club with some shady dudes or that he was getting clean from the Bolivian marching powder, but they were determined to find out. They told Karimova they'd like to have dinner with him after the Tulane game, so Karimova was trying not to think about what his parents might ambush him with at dinner while he was playing in the game. Despite the anxiety, Karimova balled out in his game against Tulane. Up to this point, Karimova's output his freshman season had been a disappointment compared to his projection as a 5-star defensive end prospect who had 3 sacks per game in high school. Tulane snuck in a last-second touchdown drive before the end of the first half to tie the game, but surprisingly, FAU's offense was looking competent. They came out the gate in the 3rd, scoring a touchdown and kept Tulane's offense on their toes. Tulane would get into the red zone before settling for a field goal to make it a 4-point game. FAU's offense couldn't answer, but AK-47 removed any doubt in the outcome, racking up his 3rd sack in the end zone and forcing a game-clinching safety. After the game, Karimova went over to his parents' house where they asked him if they should have him drug tested, but rather than forcing their 19-year-old to get tested, they instead showed compassion when Karimova admitted that he had been using a little bit of white powder to help him before games. His parents sent him to a detox clinic, but it would mean that Karimova would miss FAU's next game against Southern Miss. AK-47 didn't want to miss the game, but his parents insisted on unplugging from football football and his usual crew for a little bit to get some perspective. Karimova missed their game against Southern Miss, in which the Golden Eagles put up 21 points, tying the season high given up by the FAU defense, and FAU took their 4th loss of the season, and Karimova felt like he had let his teammates down. Arlo realized he had picked the right football program, though, when he was greeted by his teammates and coaches with smiles and praise for completing this program despite the team losing. FAU really wanted to build him up, and AK-47 rededicated himself to the game because of the love his teammates and coaches showed him. FAU easily took care of Coastal Carolina, and their final regular season game was against James Madison. Even though Arlo had a quiet day, his teammates were going crazy on defense, forcing a fumble midway through the 3rd. Then with a minute left in the 4th, FAU forced another fumble, and it looked like the game was all wrapped up, but James Madison had one more trick up their sleeves. With 49 seconds remaining on 2nd and 10, the James Madison quarterback found his receiver on the sideline for a game-tying touchdown to force overtime. In overtime, FAU got the ball first and scored a touchdown, and the defense showed up again on 3rd and 4, forcing a fumble to win the game. AK-47 finished with 48 total tackles, with half of them being for a loss and 8 sacks on the season. He was ranked in the top 10 for all 3 major awards. He was 9th for the Bednarek, he was 5th for the Nagurski, and he was 4th for the Lombardi. Since FAU finished with a respectable 8-4 record, they got to play in the Hawaii Bowl, which, for a bowl game, it's not that bad of a place to travel to. They were matched up against Air Force, who was coming off of one of their best seasons in recent memory. AK-47 hadn't read the scouting report and assumed that they were an option team exclusively, but Air Force mixed it up, playing out of the gun and running some option plays and really varied it up. The biggest play of the game came after Air Force's first touchdown when they ran a halfback screen and Karimova read it like a book, but undercut the route too much, leaving the running back and his blockers with nothing in front of them, and they ended up taking it for 57 yards. On the very next play, Air Force caught FAU's defense off guard, ran a toss to the left, and scored their 2nd touchdown of the game before the end of the first half. FAU answered with a touchdown of their own, but Air Force got the ball to start the second half, and AK-47 was pulled off the field for most of the series, dealing with a toe injury, while Air Force scored a 3rd touchdown to get them to 21 points, tying the largest amount of points given up by the FAU defense all season. Despite the beautiful weather and being with his teammates, coaches, and family, Karimova was pissed off. He was insanely locked in for this game, trying to prove himself as an NFL prospect, and he also was trying to prove that FAU was a legitimate threat out of Florida. FAU's defense came out to start the 4th quarter and clamped Air Force. FAU's secondary was getting interceptions, the front 7 was stuffing the run and getting pressure on Daniels, their quarterback. FAU's D did everything they could aside from putting 7 on the board themselves, and they were incredibly frustrated after taking the L, but they also knew that this was going to be the start of something great next year.